Okay, welcome. Today we're going to present our case on IKEA and its global expansion. We'll be mentioning the Uppsala Strategy and how it has had an effect on internationalization. Yes, next. Okay, so I'll firstly talk about our outline. We will, of course, introduce the case. Secondly, we'll talk about IKEA's strategy, the Uppsala model and its low-cost benefits. Thirdly, we'll talk about the application of the theory in the specific case and the challenges and difficulties IKEA has faced throughout the years. And lastly, we will talk about the key takeaways and what are the managerial implications. Next. Okay, so a little bit about IKEA's background. It started as a Swedish furniture company in 1943. Its creator wanted to create a furniture company which would have provide cheaper furniture. And it had a lot of ups and downs throughout the years. However, as of 2018, there are 50 countries that have an IKEA store available. Most of these countries have more than one shop. So IKEA has quite internationalized quite well. However, other markets have not been as successful. The company has been using the Uppsala model when implementing their stores around the world. It had firstly spread into closer markets, which they better understood, and later they spread to more further ones. Of course, due to the homogeneous working, the company has had some failures. For example, in India, when it came to the food and culture of the company, it had quite a bit of a failure, and also in Saudi Arabia with the controversy surrounding their catalogs, which were not meeting the standards of the cultural values of the country. Next.
So now IKEA and the Uppsala model. So as we heard previously, IKEA is a Swedish low-cost furniture firm, and it uses the Uppsala model in order to internationalize. So the Uppsala model states that firstly, you expand domestically. You need to be successful in your domestic home market. Then in the second step, you expand towards countries which are geographically and culturally close to your home country. And in the third step, you expand towards countries which are geographically and culturally distant from your home country. That is exactly what IKEA did. So they started with their first expansion in 1963, after being 5 years into business, to Oslo, Norway. Then their second expansion was into Denmark 6 years later. And these two countries are Scandinavian countries, and therefore comparatively relatively low, say similar to the culture and geographics of Sweden. Then their first expansion outside of Scandinavia was to Switzerland in 1973, and only later to Germany. These countries are still part of part two from the Uppsala model, because these countries are still relatively similar culturally and relatively close geographically. And in the mid to late 70s, the first expansion was to distant countries like Japan, Australia, and Hong Kong, which were culturally and geographically, of course, more distant. Next slide. Then concerning low-cost strategy of IKEA. So their vision statement states that they want to create a better everyday life for the many people. And in order to be for the many people, you have to be affordable and therefore being low priced. And in order to be low priced, you have to produce at low costs. So they started to outsourcing their manufacturing relatively early. Back in the day, it was to Eastern Europe. And through that outsourcing from the manufacturing, they were able to get a competitive advantage towards the competitors, because they were able to offer furniture which were cheaper than theirs of their competitors. Nowadays, for example, they opened a supply base in Vietnam, because Vietnam offered low labor cost and low cost of raw materials. And IKEA in return provided long-term high-volume business relations and gave them advice concerning how to improve productivity and yeah, how to cut costs eventually. And nowadays they plan to open a store in Vietnam, so that is a perfect example from the Uppsala model. First, you be successful in your home market, which they obviously are. Then you go to a new market which you want to enter, and you start by setting up a supply base and checking out the market. And in the end, you open a base of operations, in this case, a store in Vietnam. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Zeno. So moving on to the application of the theory, that in order to understand the distances that will be incorporated to in our Uppsala model, we assess the countries using CAGE framework, that stands for cultural, administrative, geographic, and economic differences. And these distances have the details that you can see on the slide. And from the CAGE distances rank from New York University website, we can see that all the Scandinavian countries rank on the top 5 of the distances, CAGE distances rank from Sweden as the benchmark. And we can see as well that the first 2 countries outside Scandinavian countries where IKEA expanded to, namely Germany and Switzerland, still also as in the top 10 of the CAGE distance rank. What we can see here is that this framework in assessing country distances supported the Uppsala strategies that IKEA adopted in their internationalizations. And these countries, namely Switzerland and Germany, has proven to be successful in the expansion. And moving on, my colleagues Devin will also expand the example of other cases.
Thank you, Antam. So the CAGE model suggests that closer countries are more attractive. And as previously mentioned, IKEA has been relatively mostly successful in Europe, throughout Europe. Now, if we move on to further away countries that are more further away, in this case, India, well, IKEA's entry into India hasn't really been smooth. And that's actually an understatement. It took 12 years for IKEA just to be able to set up its first branch in the city of Hyderabad, because first it tried to acquire permission from the Indian government in 2006, but failed to do that. And it's only 6 years later that they returned to India and finally reapplied for the regulation after for the permission after several regulation amendments by the Indian government. And if we move on to the next slide, even after setting up their first branch in the city of Hyderabad, IKEA is still facing ongoing struggles. For example, compliance with local sourcing requirements, or keeping their prices affordable, as well as facing price-oriented customers. Because as it turns out, Indian customers don't really pay attention to the quality of products. They only, this is generally speaking, they only focus on the price of the products. And so even in their first 12 years of just trying to enter India, not even operating in India, but just trying to enter India, they're already facing huge administrative problems caused by administrative distance. And just as they're settling in, now they're facing huge problems caused by economic distance. And another case would be Saudi Arabia. If you go to the next slide. So in Saudi Arabia, we can say that IKEA has succeeded in entering Saudi Arabia, but however, adapting to high distance countries come at a cost. In this case, IKEA Saudi Arabia branch had to remove women from its catalog, such as pictures and advertisements, because they received complaints from customers and staff and local governments. And this sparked backlash in Western countries. Ironically, the Saudis, there were no response from the Saudis, but it did spark backlash from Western countries, and it ended up being a contradiction with the company's own values. And this is another price that IKEA has to pay when entering high distance countries. And so moving on, we go to the managerial implications of these cases.
So thanks, Devin. So I'm going to talk about the key takeaway on managerial implication. So first, what to learn from the successes of IKEA. So IKEA has created a strong identity and has adapted its catalog to fit in some country. The brand still keeps its Swedish roots and the catalog looks nearly the same everywhere. But with the expansion towards geographically and culturally distant country, IKEA needed to adapt. So they do not spread their typical Swedish identity all over the world. They make a lot of adjustment. So, for example, in Japan, the do-it-yourself part of IKEA, which had been a problem 20 years before, is now a part of the marketing strategy. So, secondly, outsourcing the manufacturer have reduced your prices and has obviously enabled an expansion and also created an attractiveness for the customer. It explains the success, for example, in Europe. Finally, for the successes, globalization has eased the difficulty to adapt in far country. For example, in Japan, it's been easier 20 years later. A better knowledge of the culture was also possible. So secondly, what to learn from the failure and the challenges IKEA needed to face. So a further expansion needs more ongoing learning to understand how to adapt. Market research is fundamental to succeed, and the Uppsala strategy has its failure. A rigid business model is not good for an expansion, as stated for the IKEA's entry in India. So going global is tricky. It's a good compromise between adapting to the local specificities while staying faithful to the brand philosophy. So the example for this situation is obviously Saudi Arabia. So the combination of the company's universalistic value promoting gender equality and the respect of the cultural context led to IKEA failure. Finally, the cultural distance is a key factor which always should be taken into account. IKEA should not expect the globalization to erase all local specificities. Next slide. So thank you all for your attention from the group 4A.